The rain hammered against the windscreen of the rental car as Captain Sarah Mitchell navigated the narrow roads leading to Hereford, her knuckles white against the steering wheel, not from tension, but from anticipation. 3 tours in Afghanistan had carved away any excess softness from her features, leaving behind sharp-ched the peculiar stillness of someone who had learned to wait in absolute silence while death passed inches away. The letter of acceptance to Special Air Service selection sat folded in her breast pocket, its crisp edges already softened from the dozens of times she had unfolded it to confirm this that they had actually said yes to her application after 2 years of rejections and appeals that had climbed all the way to the Ministry of Defense. The gates of Sterling Lines appeared through the grey morning mist, like something from a fever dream, and as she showed her identification to the guard, she caught the slight widening of his eyes, imperceptible shake of his head as he waved her through. She had expected this reaction, had steeled herself for it during the long months of preparation that had seen her body fat drop to 7%, and her running times approach those of Olympic athletes. What she had not expected was the sheer number of men already gathered in the assembly area, 127 candidates standing in loose formations, gaze turning toward her with the weight of an avalanche. The selection directing staff materialized from the administrative building, like wolves emerging from fog, their faces carved from granite and skepticism. The chief instructor, a sergeant major whose accent carried the hills of Wales, looked at her for a long moment before addressing the group, his voice carrying across the parade of artillery. The briefing was short and brutal, outlining 5 weeks that would systematically destroy everything they thought they knew about their own limitations. When he mentioned that this selection course would make history, his eyes found hers, that her presence here was viewed not as progress but as political theater, a box-ticking exercise forced upon them by distant bureaucrats who had never felt their lungs burn in thin mountain air or their minds fracture under interrogation. The fan dance came on day 3, after 2 days of fitness tests and psychological evaluations that had already culled % of the candidates. The Brecon beacons loomed in the pre-dawn darkness, their peaks invisible in clouds that promised nothing but misery. Sarah adjusted the 65-pound burden on her shoulders, feeling the familiar bite of straps that would carve grooves into her flesh over the coming hours. The route was 24 kilometers of brutal elevation changes, ancient paths that turned to rivers in the rain, and she had memorized every contour from satellite images and after-action reports written by those who had attempted and failed. The starting gun cracked through the darkness, and she moved into the teeth of the wind that screamed down from the peaks with enough force to knock grown men sideways. Within the first hour, the horizontal rain had soaked through every layer of clothing, turning the weight on her back into something living and malevolent. She found her rhythm in the suffering, that peculiar place where pain became simply another piece of data to be legs drove pistons into the muddy ground, each step calculated to maintain maximum efficiency, while others around her began the deadly dance of pushing too hard too early. By the halfway point, she had passed 40 candidates, their faces masks of disbelief as she powered past them with mechanical staff, barely looked up as she punched her card, already dismissing her inevitable collapse that would surely come on the return journey. But Sarah had learned in the mountains of Afghanistan that the body could endure far more than the mind believed possible, had discovered that there existed a place beyond exhaustion where something else took over, something forged in moments when surrender meant not just failure, but death. The descent was where most would break, quadriceps screaming as they fought to control the momentum of body and pack. But she had trained for this specific agony, had spent months running down the steepest hills could find with progressively heavier weights. She passed the last cluster of candidates with 5 kilometers remaining, ignoring their gasps of disbelief, focusing only on the rhythm of breath and stride that would carry her to the finish. When she crossed the line, 40 minutes clear of the next finisher, the directing staff said nothing, merely her time with expressions that suggested this was somehow a mistake that would correct itself in the coming trials. The resistance to interrogation phase began 2 weeks later, after navigation exercises and weapons handling had trimmed the group to 68 survivors. The facility was a nondescript building that had been a warehouse anywhere in industrial Britain, but Sarah recognized the subtle signs of soundproofing, the reinforced doors, the cameras that tracked every movement. They stripped her of everything but basic clothing, placed a hood over her head that smelled of fear sweat from countless wearers, and the world contracted to darkness and waiting. The stress positions came first, arms extended against walls at angles that turned muscles to fire, legs spread wide until tendons screamed for mercy. The white noise followed, a frequency calculated to prevent sleep, while slowly eruated by sudden silences that were somehow worse than the noise itself. She retreated into the mental fortress she had constructed during 6 days of Taliban captivity 2 years prior, when her patrol had been overrun and she had been the only survivor, held in a mud-walled compound while negotiations for her release played thousands of miles away. Hours blended into each other, marked only by changes in the torture, routine. They brought her into interrogation rooms where voices demanded information about fictional operations, where lights blazed with the intensity of desert suns, where temperature swung from Arctic cold to surf. She gave them nothing but name, rank, and service number, her voice remaining steady even as her body shook from exhaustion and dehydration. The psychological games were more insidious, recordings of crying children, suggestions that her unit had abandoned her, that she had already failed, and this was merely entertainment for the staff. 30 before they finally released her, and she emerged to find that 12 more candidates had voluntarily withdrawn, their minds broken by far less time than she had endured. The directing staff watched her walk steadily to the recovery area, no stumbling, no collapse, and she saw something shift in their expressions, a grudging recognition, not the political stunt they had assumed. Brunei brought jungle warfare training, and with it, a different kind of hell. The humidity was a living thing that made every breath feel like drowning, and the jungle itself seemed determined to consume them through 1,000 small wounds. Sarah thrived in the green labyrinth, her navigation skills keeping her patrol on visibility dropped to mere meters, her smaller frame allowing her to move through undergrowth that snagged and exhausted larger men. On day 4 of the jungle phase, a fer-de-lance struck her calf during a river crossing, its fangs punching through her gaiter to deliver venom that would have most people screaming for medical evacuation. She treated it herself with the feel, using a scalpel to open the wound wider, forcing out what venom she could while her patrol watched in stunned silence. The next 12 hours were agony as the toxins worked through her system, causing fever and hallucinations that she concealed behind tactical face paint and iron will. She refused evacuation, continued leading her patrol through their objectives, and only allowed herself to collapse once they had reached the extraction point and the exercise was complete. The medical officer who examined her later said she should have been dead or at minimum permanently damaged, but Sarah had learned that should was a word for people who had not been tested in survival. The final phase was combat survival in the Scottish Highlands, escape and evasion with hunter forces drawn from active regiment squadrons, who knew every trick and had no investment in seeing her succeed. They dropped her with minimal equipment into terrain that offered little cover, and with instructions to reach a series of checkpoints while avoiding capture. For 6 days, she became something barely human, existing on lichens scraped from rocks and water filtered through cloth torn from her clothing. She moved only at night, burying herself in peat bogs during daylight, letting the earth itself hide her thermal signature from helicopters. Twice the hunter forces passed within meters of her position, their dogs catching her scent, but losing it in the streams she used to break her trail. By the fifth day, hallucinations from starvation and exhaustion painted the landscape with impossible colors, but she maintained operational security, following the protocols even as her body consuming itself for fuel. When she finally reached the final checkpoint, she had lost 23 pounds and looked like something excavated from a grave. But she had not been captured, had not compromised a single objective. The results were posted on a rain-soaked morning that felt like an echo of her arrival. Her name sat scores that exceeded anything in selection history. But the commanding officer's adjutant was already waiting to escort her to a private office where truth lived behind closed doors and careful words about exceptional performance and institutional readiness painted a picture of denial that had nothing to do with capability and everything to do with fear of change itself.